Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast, a home for critical thinking and common sense. I hope that everyone is having a wonderful start to 2022. I'm honored to welcome Speaker Newt Gingrich as my first guest this year. Newt is chairman of Gingrich 360, a multimedia production and consulting company based in Arlington, Virginia. As former Speaker of the House, Newt is well known as the architect of the contract with America that led the Republican Party to victory in 1994, creating the first conservative majority in the House in 40 years. He was a Republican candidate for President of the United States in 2012. Newt is a Fox News contributor, podcast host, and syndicated columnist. He's the author of 41 books. His latest book is Beyond Biden, Rebuilding the America We Love. I'm excited to share our conversation. Speaker Gingrich, Newt, my friend, colleague, and fellow conservative, welcome to my podcast.
Well, I'm delighted. I was thrilled because I remember so fondly the time we spent together at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm such a great admirer of you and the courage you've displayed over and over again throughout your career. So it's an honor to be with you.
I think it's a greater honor for me to be with you. And I really wanted to start with your incredibly interesting and rich life and your personal life. And your personal growth is very interesting, but you also lived in interesting times. My audience, at least some of them, are quite young, and I thought I would ask you about your background when you were born, the America that you grew up in the 1950s, 1960s. Let's get into that.
Well, I think from their standpoint, I'm sort of a historic artifact. I was born in the middle of World War II in 1943. I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Grew up in I think what would have been called a lower middle class family. My father was the first one to graduate from college. He ended up in the Army and found that he really liked it, went to the Korean War. And then so I became an Army brat. I spent the first 10 or 11 years of my life in Harrisburg. And then we moved to Fort Riley, Kansas, which was a very interesting place. And then from there to Orléans, France, and Stuttgart, Germany. And finally from there to Fort Benning at Columbus, Georgia, which I got to as a junior in high school. And I think I had a very idyllic childhood. I had lots of relatives who allowed me to play interesting games, took me down to Philadelphia to the zoo and to the museum, the Academy of Natural Sciences. We'd go down and visit the battlefield at Gettysburg. My father had gone to Gettysburg College, so there was a tie there. In fact, my niece just graduated from Gettysburg College. And when I got to Georgia as a junior, I just sort of stayed and became a Georgian. Went to Emory University and then on to Tulane, where I got a master's and a PhD, and did my graduate work in Brussels. And then went back home, but ran for Congress in 74 during Watergate and lost, ran again in 76 with Jimmy Carter at the head of the Democratic ticket and lost, and finally won in 1978. And I spent 16 years working to build a majority. And in 1994, we had a contract with America. Everything came together, and we won the first Republican majority in 40 years. And 2 years later, we were the first re-elected Republican majority since 1930. So, it was a wild and very interesting life.
Absolutely. And we'll get into the details of some of those political high points.
But the 1950s, when I read and listen to people who actually lived those years, some of it idealize it as that was a time that America was at its best, while others speak about the 1950s as a period when it was all dreadful. How would you describe that?
Well, I think it's a lot like Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. I mean, if you were African American, we still had legal segregation. I was shocked because I'd grown up first in Pennsylvania and then in an integrated U.S. Army, and I didn't encounter segregation until I was a junior in high school. Mm-hmm. And segregation was real, and it was horrible, and it was imposed by the local state government, Democrats, I might point out. So I think from an African American standpoint, there was no good old days. Mm-hmm. I think from the standpoint of if you were Jewish, you had some discrimination and you felt it. If you were Catholic, you had a tiny bit of discrimination, but not much by the 1950s and 60s. And if you were Protestant, this had been originally created as a white Protestant European country, and you felt like you were sort of kings of the hill. Mm-hmm. We certainly were, at that point, the richest and most powerful country in the world. And that had an impact, I think, on most American lives. And through the Eisenhower years, we were really living off of the sense of general accomplishment in World War II, having defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan and fascist Italy. And we were dealing with a Cold War, but it didn't decisively change our lives. I think that, things were getting better. You had television, then you had color television. This may seem trivial, but I think for most people, there was a sense of progress in general. Yeah. People moved out to the suburbs after World War II, and it was a country on the move. I think that beginning in the early 60s, you began to have significant disruptions, and much of what we're currently living through can be traced back, I think, to the early 1960s.
The 1960s. But before you get to the 60s, when you say, African Americans, for them, there were no good old days. And then Jews felt some discrimination, Catholics as well, and so on. I think it's interesting to when you say, local state governments, Democrats in charge, and they were the enforcers of segregation. Is that just a partisan swipe, or is that factual?
No, factually, every single governor of a segregated state was a Democrat. The state legislatures of every single segregated state were Democrats. The sheriffs who were enforcing the law were Democrats. Bull Connor was a Democrat. It was just the nature of the Southern Democratic Party. The Northern Democratic Party was for integration, and the Republican Party was for integration. And it was a long, difficult process. It's hard to remember, but as late as 1940, it was a fairly bold act to pass a federal anti-lynching bill that said you can't lynch Americans. I mean, you would have thought that was pretty straightforward and pretty easy, but there was huge hostility among the Southern Democrats against these kind of interferences. They still had a sense of being the Confederacy and a sense of being imposed upon by these Yankees. I had this odd background because on the one hand, I was born in Pennsylvania. My family all would have fought on the Union side. We certainly were deeply committed to civil rights, just as a natural course of things. And so from my background, arriving in Georgia, it was a pretty big shock. Now, which is not to say, by the way, that life was always easy for African Americans in the North. There were race riots. There was real tension at times. And we have to remember, America has always been a very rough and tumble country. From our very founding, from the earliest days, we've always had a fairly high level of violence. And it's in part a byproduct of individualism. If you have lots of highly energetic individuals, they bounce off of each other occasionally, and sometimes that bouncing and that competition becomes fairly physical.
I think that's very interesting, and it's fantastic for people to hear that. I will get back to this complex relationship between Democrats, the Democratic Party, and race relations, since it's now become, in some ways, the only issue that they want to talk about, and the racialization of everything. I'll get back to that as we get to the 2000s. But let's go back to the 50s and 60s. What happened in the 50s that led to that explosion in the 60s? Sexual revolution, free speech, civil rights movement.
Well, there were a lot of things going on. The intellectual rebellion against the middle class really goes back into the 1920s. And if you read some of the novels, you really have this underlying sense that the academic class really saw itself fleeing from the kind of middle class bourgeois values that had dominated much of America. But I think at the same time, you had a general sense of rules that people followed, and that the system sort of worked. And I think that had been reinforced by World War II and the mobilization of 15 million Americans in uniform, and the general sense that, you took on big things and you got big things done. By the early 60s, you really had a generational change. I think it was no accident that you had General Eisenhower, who was sort of a grandfather figure by the end of his presidency, gets replaced by John F. Kennedy, who represented kind of a younger, more dynamic, newer generation. And you had 3 or 4 different things going on in parallel. You had a free speech movement starting at Berkeley, where people were basically proclaiming the right to make a nuisance of themselves and be tolerated. You had a left-wing anti-American bring down the system movement, captured largely by various student groups. You had the emergence of the civil rights movement. You had, I think, the killing of John F. Kennedy was a shocking moment, and one in which people, for the first time, began on a large basis to be disillusioned by what was going on. As you pointed out, you had a sexual revolution at 2 levels. One was, frankly, that the emergence of the pill allowed women to engage in relationships with much less risk than they had historically. I mean, historically, sex had been 20 minutes for a man and 20 years for a woman. And so women had a legitimate caution that in many ways made American society less overtly involved in sexual behavior. And beginning in the late 50s, early 60s, that all broke down. And parallel to that, you had the emergence of the objective reality that in a society moving from physical strength to mental strength, women have huge advantages. And so all of a sudden, women could become, the world of professions opened up. You really see this if you watch something like Mad Men, where you see the sort of male exploitation of females as a norm, which was beginning to die out in the 60s. And women were beginning to assert themselves more and more. They're very interesting. Somebody once did a study and pointed out that when Elizabeth Taylor overtly steals Eddie Fisher from his wife and gets away with it, Debbie Reynolds, who everybody loved and was charmed by. And the initial reaction of the public was very negative. And historically, movie stars had sort of been very careful about public opinion. But Taylor was such a huge star, it didn't matter. And if it didn't matter for Taylor, it actually didn't matter for anybody else either. So you had a real breakdown across the board, a breakdown in language. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the senator from New York and great sociologist, wrote a piece in 1993 called Defining Deviancy Down. And based on the sociological idea that if something becomes common, you have to find a way to accommodate it. So language, for example, today, people say things today, use words today, which if they'd done that in the 1960s, they would have been ostracized and punished. Now it's just sort of, if you watch a lot of movies, it's amazing the language that we think is tolerable. And that spread across the whole culture. So you had real hostility over the tension building with the civil rights movement. You had, in a sense, that the old order had failed, and you had this new order emerging. You had a real contest between a younger generation in things like the free speech movement and the sexual revolution. Then you had the emergence of a hard left that we really hadn't seen much of, probably since the late post-World War I period. I mean, you suddenly had people, you had Black Panthers who said that they're openly said that they were in the business of assassinating police. And there were, I think, 7 New York City policemen assassinated during this period. You had the weathermen who were white, who desperately wanted the support and endorsement of the Black Panthers, who wouldn't give it to them because they were white. And so the weathermen generated a whole range of bombings. People forget that as late as 1970 or so, there were like 1,200 bombings in 1 year. We had a professor at the University of Wisconsin killed with a bomb. We had a professor at Columbia have his lifetime work destroyed by a mob. There was a period there where the system was on the edge of breaking down. You had 1 million people gathering at the Pentagon, and you had a huge anti-war movement. So it's sort of the anti-war movement, the free speech movement, the civil rights movement, sexual liberation, and the changing sense of what you're allowed to say and do. All of those came together in a swirling stew, if you will, societal stew. And then the society caught a hold of itself and said, that's enough. And the 70s became much duller. Yeah. And the revolutionary surge it sort of burned itself out for the moment. It reappeared, you could argue, in the last 5 or 6 years. But for a long period, it was essentially quiescent and a modest part of our lives, not a center of our lives.
Would you say that, would you connect any kind of economic conditions to the cultural upheaval? Is it correct to say when the economy is doing well, then you have some of these cultural highs, and then when you get to inflation and unemployment, things settle down and people sober up?
Well, that could be part of it. I mean, part of what was going on was you were creating through colleges a mass aristocracy that had never existed before.
Right.
You had millions of young people who thought that having learned something was the same as having done something, and who thought that they were by definition smarter than their parents because they'd read more books, and who were quite prepared to challenge the old order. And that became a continuous problem because we actually produce more people in the elites than we have jobs for them.
Yeah.
And so you inevitably have a substantial number of people who are underemployed and who feel that they're really smarter, better educated, and deserve more than they're going to get. And that leads to a lot of tension. And I think we're seeing it reemerge now because we're producing vastly more students as graduates than we could possibly find adequately status-rich jobs. And it's really not so much about the money. It's about the sense of status.
Right. And I'm trying to see the parallels between back then and now. The issues for African Americans, for women, and later on for gay people, homosexuals, those were real issues. We were making real strides, changing laws, changing the culture. A lot has been achieved undeniably in America. So now in, the 2010s, the beginning of 2020s, we have groups that have styled themselves as civil rights activists, but it's not quite clear what exactly it is that they are fighting for and hope to achieve.
Well, I think, they think they know what they're fighting for. Look, I think it's fascinating. This is the most open culture in the world. It may well be the most open great power in history. We are constantly absorbing new ideas, whether it's a hula hoop or a Big Mac or a smartphone or Netflix. If you just watch the continuous, unending, beach volleyball, which I once talked about at a national convention, and people thought I was crazy. But I was trying to make the point that there's this constant rhythm of innovation and experimentation, and some of it involves personal life. Is a transgendered male swimming at the University of Pennsylvania really a female? And is the fact that transgendered male is inevitably going to break every record? Because, and again, from a pure feminist standpoint, this is heresy. But the fact is, males tend to be genetically equipped with much greater upper body strength.
Yeah.
And so if you're in any kind of sport where upper body strength matters and you allow transgendered males to compete, they're going to win. You've in effect repealed Title IX, and women are not going to be winners in those kind of competitions, which is just causing a fascinating level of confusion. At one level, you get into fights over boys and girls' bathrooms, which is in a sense a cultural fight.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, you can certainly design unisex bathrooms, and you could work it out in a way that who cares? If you're, as you know, you're very well traveled. If you go to Europe, you have a much different attitude about some of this stuff. But the difference in part is we are always churning. My theory is that no institution in America is strong enough to block the future.
Right.
And so futures keep evolving, whether you like it or not. They keep showing up, and you keep getting, brilliant innovators, whether it's Sam Walton inventing Walmart, or it's the invention of Apple, Steve Jobs coming back from having been fired to reinvent Apple, which was going broke, or it's the invention of Amazon. There's this continuous American behavior that I think probably drives our competitors crazy. We have a totally bureaucratized space program that is screwing around, not doing very much exciting stuff. A lot of exciting science, but not very much exciting about getting into space.
Right.
And along comes Elon Musk and invents the reusable rocket, transforms the entire economics of space, and probably will get to Mars before the Americans or the Chinese.
It is a South African immigrant. No, I think that's really amazing. But earlier on, you said something, I think when you were describing the 60s, that there were the groups that were rebelling against the status quo, fighting for the rights of African Americans, women, and etc., and with a vision for improving things. And then you said there were the bring the down system people. And these let's bring the entire down system people, they sort of kept their heads down for a while and seem now to be re-emerging. I think there's been a shift in this conflict between the people of the 1950s who wanted to keep things the way they were. Those are gone. They've lost the argument. They're just in small pockets and are irrelevant all over America. The people who are actually innovating and improving the system, they've achieved most of what they wanted. We just talked about that. But they never reckoned that the bring the system down people would re-emerge in education, in culture, in corporations, and present this new challenge. And these bring down the system people. Some of the ideas, if you look into it, and you've written about it in Beyond Biden, the ideas are actually reactive, divisive, and take us back to segregation, but with a new narrative.
Well, it's very interesting. I went back to try to think through some of this and reread Theodore White's Making of the President, 1968, and his book, Making of the President, 1972. His chapter on the news media in 68 almost exactly captures where we are today. His chapter on George McGovern and the Radicals in his 1972 book, he has a key phrase. He says, what really went wrong was that the liberal ideology became a liberal theology.
Yeah.
And from that point on, you couldn't debate it because it was a quasi-religious belief system. And that's part of what we haven't come to grips with. What you have on the left today is a secular religion. Why does the United Nations end up listening to a teenager who doesn't know anything? Because she is symbolic. She's sort of like Joan of Arc, emerging to drive the British out, the English, I don't want to blame the entire island, the English out of France. And Joan of Arc was, of course, the Maid of Orleans. And now we get the Maid of Stockholm. And she's there to drive the evil forces out of the UN, all of whom she has total contempt for. Because frankly, she's so young, so pampered, and so wealthy. She hasn't got a clue. Yeah. But we all, of course, have to pretend that she's a marvelous public figure, imbued with some mystical, deep belief system. It's purely a religious phenomenon. It's not a political phenomenon. And what you have on the left is a combination of mental illness and secular religion. And we debate these people as though we're talking about ideas, but we're not. They're offering us a close to the passion and energy of the Reformation, or the early French Revolution, when they changed the dates of the months, and because they went to 10-day weeks, they had to change the date of the name of every day. That only lasted for a while until Napoleon thought it was so stupid he got rid of it. But there was this brief period where they were inventing a brand new world of equality and fraternity, largely driven by the guillotine, which would cut off your head if you didn't understand how to say equality and fraternity correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that. I think it's also important to make a distinction within the left. As you know, we live in a very liberal state, California. And I can clearly see that the left is really divided into two groups. Liberals, you could describe them the way you describe maybe Joe Manchin. The center left, they actually in many ways are spiritual. The Jewish community that I know here, they attend their synagogues, people go to church. They are very much attached to the nuclear family, love America. They would like the government to take that old argument of how much government do you want in the system. They tend to lean towards more government, but there's a completely different left, a different wing of the left, where you would place the squad, the people who want to defund the police, but let's bring down the system type of left. And I think the major problem for the left today, for liberals in general, is the decent pro-American patriotic liberals are terrified or in any way inhibited by these radical wing, and they're giving in to them to an extent that's destructive, first and foremost, for their own party.
Well, no, first of all, I think you're right, and it's legitimate to distinguish classic liberal Democrats who believe in bigger government. They believe in the efficacy of bureaucracy. They are genuinely concerned about civil liberties. They accept higher levels of taxation, but they represent a tradition that certainly goes back before Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The challenge they have is they're a little bit like Kerensky in the Russian Revolution, or like the moderates in the French Revolution. The hard-edged left in both of those revolutions ultimately destroyed the moderates because there was no common ground. And I think this is why you see people like Manchin. I don't, because she's so quiet, it's harder to understand Sinema than Manchin. Manchin's an old-time politician who has sort of boundaries of what he's capable of doing. I think Sinema is actually in the tradition of John McCain and Barry Goldwater, and sort of an Arizona maverick. And I think that she's probably in some ways tougher than Manchin, because I don't think she has any need to be a friendly, happy politician, where I think Manchin really wants to be liked, and Manchin really comes out of a classic political class. But both of them are caught up in the Kerenskyite problem that the hard-edged people, whether it's the Cheka under Lenin or it's the folks with the guillotine under Robespierre. Cliff and I once went to the cemetery in downtown Paris where the nuns were buried along with the aristocrats. The nuns refused to give up their belief in God, and so they were all guillotined. And they actually went to the guillotine singing because they were now going to meet God. And they're buried, and the aristocrats are there. It's actually the cemetery that Lafayette is buried in, not because he was bothered by the revolution, but because so many of his wife's relatives had been guillotined, and she wanted to be buried in the same cemetery with him. Well, you walk around, you look at that, and you realize this is a little bit like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and for that matter, Stanford, in the treatment of deviant professors who actually, for example, believe that George Washington was okay, or who think that Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence was a good thing. We haven't gotten to a guillotine yet, although the numbers of Democrats who believe that if you don't get vaccinated, you should be locked up permanently is astounding.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's a totalitarian COVID state.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy. So we've now talked about, and I think we've talked about the divisions within the left. The moderates that might be overwhelmed or may end up standing up to the radicals, we'll see. Let's talk about the divisions within the Conservatives and Republican Party. What do you make of that?
Well, people used to ask me, why do you have so many people on the left in Hollywood and there's no parallel group on the right? And as I began to explore, I realized that there were actually a lot of people in Hollywood who were conservative, but their number one characteristic is they didn't like to go to meetings. Whereas the left loved going to meetings. And so the left thought this was great. We're going to have another meeting tomorrow night about saving the whales or, paying for AIDS or something. Doesn't really matter what it was. It's going to be a meeting. And they would all gather together in large lemming-like groups. Meanwhile, all of the conservatives were distinguished by the fact that they wouldn't go to a meeting under any circumstance. So they could never get organized. It's like the anarchist picnic. And so when you start talking about the right is a large conglomerate of people, many of whom are characterized by not being the left. Mm-hmm. So they get up in the morning and they don't, they're not signing up for Rotary, or they're not going to become part of the NRA. They're not the left.
Yeah.
They broadly believe in the Constitution. They're broadly patriotic. They generally believe in some form of free enterprise. They are very hostile to bureaucracy. They're deeply hostile to left-wing ideologies. But beyond that, they're a remarkably sort of conglomerate gathering of personalities that aren't quite. It's really funny. Back in the 1930s, Will Rogers, who was a comedian in that era, said, I don't belong to an organized party. I'm a Democrat. Well, now I would reverse that now. I would say the Democratic Party is, in fact, extraordinarily organized and uses real muscle. And the Republican Party is this huge conglomerate that runs from the sort of moderate personality who just wants to make the world better. And we have governors, for example, in Maryland, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, none of whom would be automatically categorized as hard conservatives. Right. They're moderate conservatives. They're for somewhat less government. They're for somewhat more police. They're tough on crime. They think schools should actually educate. So they have a number of radical views in that sense. But they're basically managers.
Yeah.
They want to manage the system. And then you have this large Trump movement, which in fact wants to repudiate the dominant order from FDR to the present. And they're very different from the sort of moderates. And we have sort of, I think, in a way, more natural tension in our coalition, but exactly like the old FDR coalition, which after all had segregationists in Mississippi and blacks in Chicago. It had Catholics in Boston and Jews in Miami, and somehow kept the whole thing together by focusing them on how much they disliked Republicans. What the hard left is doing for us is it is driving an amazing number of people towards us on the grounds of not them.
Right.
I must be a Republican because I'm not them.
Yeah, but obviously that's not enough, right? Would you say that there is a class divide within Republicans, within conservatives?
Well, I'm not quite sure I know what you mean.
Okay. A lot of Trump supporters from rural areas may be with, if they have college degrees, it's from community colleges, or they have no college education.
Right.
That's a class, a lower social class than, say, the Republicans or conservatives from larger areas with college degrees in corporate and business life. And
yeah, I would say that one of the great revolutions of the last 20 years is that the Democrats have become the party of the well-educated white elite, and the Republicans are increasingly the party of almost everybody else, including a growing number of African Americans and a very substantial growth among Latinos and the beginning of real growth among Asian Americans. And that's a really dramatic shift in where you get your votes. One of the things that in the Virginia governor's race, Glenn Youngkin's team very early on did some very sophisticated analysis, and they concluded it was easier to get Black and Latino votes than it was to get well-educated white liberals. That in fact they weren't reachable anymore. And I think in that sense you've seen a very profound shift. There's a fascinating book by Charles Murray called Coming Apart, which he wrote, I think, about 2012. And Murray goes out and does a zip code analysis and concludes that there are identifiable zip codes in which people from Harvard, Princeton, and Yale and parallel schools, they live in those zip codes, they marry in those zip codes, they socialize in those zip codes, and they are astonishingly isolated from the rest of the country. And after I read his book, I would tell reporters in 2015 and 16 that you would have understood how good Trump was on television if you'd seen The Apprentice. But because The Apprentice did not follow Downton Abbey on PBS, you never saw it because you would never watch some kind of rude commercial. So you had no notion that for years he had been extraordinarily popular on television and was very effective at it. And I think that's part of what you had here, that Trump began with a genuine audience that had been watching him for a long time. I told people there's a movie with Mark Wahlberg about the real life story of a guy in Philadelphia who tries out for the Philadelphia Eagles and gets to play for a couple of years, almost on a lark. And the opening of the movie is in a South Philadelphia bar, where you have these blue collar guys who are all, sort of verbally beating on each other because it's how they interact. And I said, if you watch that, you understand a large part of Trump's appeal, that the very toughness and the very nature of his language fit that bar. Mm-hmm. And those people had never seen a candidate for president who sounded like them. And they were intrigued. They were reassured. They were tired of being lectured by Yale graduates and Harvard graduates, et cetera. And so I think that in that sense, there is a real class distinction in American politics. And candidly, it's not something anybody could have projected, say, in 1962.
Yeah, there's certainly a shift in demographics where working class people tend, whether they're African American, whether they're immigrants, Hispanics, they tend to lean towards the conservatives and eventually the Republican Party. I see a huge opportunity for the Republican Party there. But I think that it really also is a tension within the Republican Party on this class issue, where there is an establishment class of Republicans who feel incredibly uncomfortable with Trump, the Trump rallies, what happened on January 6th, and that tension, I don't think it has been resolved. It would be great if it were resolved, but I think it's...
Well, I think it'll be very interesting over the next couple of years to see how people deal with the internal tension that they're living under, because I think you're right. So a significant number of them are now gone. They're now Democrats, or they're independents who are going to vote for the left. The challenge for the left is that the Biden, Harris, Schumer, Pelosi team is so bad that there are a growing number of people who aren't comfortable with Trump, but they may be more uncomfortable with the left.
That's right.
And they're sort of caught in the middle. There's a survey that just came out that 70% of the country hopes that Biden will not run for re-election.
Wow.
Now, that's an astonishing number, and that means he's losing probably 20 or 30% of the Democratic Party.
And that brings me, Newt, to your book, Beyond Biden, and the supermajority you speak of, just by posing those 10 questions, where you say most Americans, the numbers are really fascinating, very high on each one of those questions. Let's go very quickly through them. And then I want to ask you about foreign policy because of what's going on in Ukraine, what Biden did in Afghanistan, and how much damage he can do. So I'll first very quickly go through these questions because...
Well, let me start and point out the reason I wrote Beyond Biden is I thought Biden would be bad enough that an anti-Biden book really wouldn't work very well because you don't need it.
Yeah.
No. But if you look at the questions we talked about, 91% of Americans believe that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was right, that the content of your character is more important than the color of your skin. That cuts directly across the left's vision of dealing with race. 74% believe able-bodied adults should be required to work for government benefits. And as you'll remember, when I was speaker, that was the welfare reform bill that we passed.
Right.
So that's 3 out of 4 Americans.
Yep.
78% still think America is the greatest country in the world. 74% favor mandatory life sentences for cop killers.
Yeah.
Compare that to the George Soros elected district attorneys who don't believe prisoners should be in jail. 75% favor federal income tax cuts. 87% want tax credits for products made in America. 81% of Americans say photo ID should be required for voting, the opposite of the bill the Democrats are trying to pass. 85% say government should protect religious freedom. 81% want children to have the choice to go to schools that are right for them. And 87% favor mandatory deportation for non-citizen gang members. Now, every single one of those is a repudiation of the modern left.
That's absolutely right. And some of these things I speak again because of where we live. I encounter lots and lots of immigrants, many of them Hispanic. They get really passionate about crime and crime prevention. They also really get passionate about entitlements, where they say very clearly, we came to this country to work and for social mobility, not for welfare, and that it shouldn't be given. And so, that supermajority. Go on.
The people who are most against big government socialism are people who come from countries that have been ruined by big government socialism. I mean, I just had a couple the other day he was from Moscow, she was from Kiev, and they're adamant that they don't want us to go down that road. And you talk to somebody from Venezuela, somebody from Cuba, somebody from Nicaragua. I mean, all these people understand that stuff doesn't work. And it breeds corruption, and it breeds ultimately dictatorship. And it's fascinating. And of course, what it's doing is because what's happened is the hard left basically stays to itself. It reads the New York Times and thinks that's the world. It goes to its own cocktail parties. This was part of the point Charlie Murray made. I first picked this up. There was a great political scientist in the early 1950s when I was first learning this business. And he recorded that in 1952, when Eisenhower was winning by a landslide, he went to a cocktail party for election night in New York with a group of intellectuals and realized that not a single person in the room had voted for Eisenhower, not one. And he said he suddenly realized that how really out of touch the academic class was with the overwhelming majority of Americans. Well, that gap has just gotten radically wider over the last 70 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, I wanted to say to my audience that it would be really, really interesting to read side by side Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, Newt Gingrich's book, Beyond Biden, and J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Energy.
That's a great. No, that's really a very. You could build an entire course around those three books.
Yeah, really, and I think it sort of cuts through. On either side of the coast, there are these stereotypes of what the American demographics are like and how set we are now. Once you read those books, you see that these beliefs and observations are really superficial. These are three great books that I think speak to the time that we live in. Can I talk to you about foreign policy?
Sure.
Your take on the top issue of today, Ukraine, and please, as you discuss it, energy policy.
Look, I think the greatest challenge I see with the current administration is historic and not political.
Right.
If we're not careful, we're going to end up either in a war with Russia, a war with China, or a war with both. We're going to end up with the Iranians making an effort to dominate the Middle East. We're going to end up in a series of problems we can't imagine. And these are historic events. They're not political events. They're the kind of events that change your life permanently. And that really scares me. And I think that Biden's recent press conference, when he made the mistake of saying that a small incursion by Russia into Ukraine might happen and might be acceptable, and they, of course, have then spent days and days walking that back. But that's the kind of mistake that could send a signal. Remember, the last small Russian incursion was seizing all of Crimea.
Yeah.
And the so-called sanctions against it had no effect. Putin looks at that. He looks at his historic record in Crimea. He's not frightened of sanctions, and particularly because the Biden energy policy, which is anti-American energy, is driving up the price of oil. Oil is the largest single source of currency for Russia. So Biden's energy policy is enriching Putin at the very moment he needs the money for his army.
Right.
And the whole thing's an absurdity. On the other front, I've written a book called Trump versus China with Claire Christensen, and I'm really worried. I think China is a much greater long-term challenge than Russia. I think that if we don't fix our schools, we have virtually no hope of winning unless we can import an amazing number of Indian and other well-trained people, because the fact is we're not producing students who are capable of dealing with the world that's emerging. And this is an enormous crisis of the American system, which our political and news media system are totally incapable of dealing with. And certainly, given the current system in Washington and the power of the teachers' unions and the power, frankly, of the very wealthy who've made so much money in China that they are, in effect, put profit above patriotism, whether it's the National Basketball Association or it's billionaires who have invested huge amounts in China. This is a real long-term problem. Yeah. And I think it's worth almost anything to avoid ending up being dominated by China and dictated to by a totalitarian system.
So would you say then in the immediate future, stay away from the Ukraine or prevent Putin from...
I I think that we should work with our allies. The Canadians already have special forces in there training Ukrainians. The British have already sent people in. I think that we should ship the most advanced, most capable weapons we can, and train the Ukrainians, and say to the Russians, you will get an amazingly bloody nose if you try to take Ukraine, and that we won't back off. That we will in fact continue to arm the Ukrainians, and there's every reason to believe Ukraine's a big enough country that it would be very hard for the Russians to occupy the whole country against Ukrainian resistance if there were sources of weapons and sources of resources outside the country.
Right.
And I think we should just indicate that with great clarity. I would be very careful about us getting directly involved,
right,
except to the degree that the Russians push the issue. But I would send American ships into the Black Sea, and I would indicate that our military aircraft are going to be landing in various Ukrainian airports and delivering equipment. And hopefully the Russians would decide that, you can get the French and the Poles and the British and the Canadians. You probably can get the Italians. I'm not sure you can get the Germans. I think the Germans have sold out for cheap natural gas. And I think the Germans will do everything they can to avoid offending the Russians. But in the long run, our strategic goal should be to produce enough American natural gas that we can offset the Russian pipeline with liquefied natural gas and gradually wean Germany off of its Russian dependency. But but other than Germany, there's no country in Europe that's in any way comfortable with Putin.
Right. So that means almost a full reversal of the Glasgow climate meeting. Next quick question on foreign policy. The Uyghur situation. There is some crazy billionaire here in Silicon Valley who went on the record to say he didn't care about the human rights of Uyghurs. But if you look at our policies, even though we don't openly say we don't care, we haven't done much. What would, a very strong America do to incentivize China to respect?
I just did a call earlier today with the state legislators from about 25 states, and I urged them to review the investment system of their pension funds and cut off investments to any fund which is investing in China. So I'd start there. I would also say that we should think seriously about sanctions, against, and this is a real fight in Congress. I mean, a number of House and Senate members have introduced bills that would, for example, penalize Nike for using slave labor.
Right.
And I think that it's crazy. I mean, how can a company like Nike buy tennis shoes made with forced labor in Western China?
Yeah.
And I think we just have to be much more militant about this, including the NBA and others. And we have to treat the Chinese communists the way we treated the Nazis in the 30s and the Soviets in the 40s and 50s. They are the mortal enemies of democracy and freedom. The things they're doing are totally unacceptable, and we have to be prepared to stay on them constantly, and potentially recreate a radio-free China, and figure out ways to get information into the country. And it's not a very stable dictatorship. It pretends it is, but they have permanent fear that the system's just going to melt down. And again, if you try to deal with 1.4 billion people, they probably have 100 million people who still live in caves and in huts. They have hundreds of millions of people whose income is very, very, very low. There is great tension about the degree of state control. They don't do all the things they do because they're satisfied. They do them because they're frightened.
Right. Wow. And obviously, then the final question is who is going to do all of these great things that you mentioned? It is in November of 2022 for the Republicans to lose the midterms.
Well, I think
it could be a landslide, it could be a wipeout, but what is it that they could do right to get it, or what is it that they could do wrong to avoid?
I did a podcast earlier today at Newt's World where I talked about really responding to Biden, where I talked about the idea that we have a two-track campaign. Track one is reality. Big government socialism isn't working. And that's just as a straight up fight of, do you think this is the best it can be? If so, vote for the Democrat. But if you think that it's not working, vote for us. And I think that will lead to amazing, almost a tsunami of people being fired. And then second, I think, is a comparative campaign of ideas. That list that I read earlier, the truth is, when you take and you explain exactly what the left is trying to do, the country generally by 3-1 or more is opposed to it.
Yep.
So I think that there's a basis there for us to win a tsunami this fall. I personally favor having something like the contract with America. I think that we ought to tell the country what we're going to do, and then we ought to spend 2023 and 24 doing it, and force Biden to choose over and over again by focusing on things the American people want. And I think that we would set the stage for a very powerful election in 24. You'd have to say that Trump's currently the front runner, but you can't say at this stage who the nominee is going to be because it's too far away.
Right.
There are too many intervening things. And as Trump himself has said, at his age, you don't know what his health will be like a year or a year and a half from now. And so you could suddenly have a wide open race, in which case people like Governor DeSantis and others would be formidable, and it'd be probably good for the country to have a healthy race.
Well, it's a great opportunity, and I think it's a wonderful note to end on. There are masses and masses of Americans who are very unhappy with the current administration, and the ideas are there. I think Republicans and conservatives do have the ideas. You lay them out in your book, but I've also seen them in other cases, and then it's just leadership. And I think that's probably the most challenging thing for the Republicans to work on, and in the future for the Democrats to do a proper autopsy of their own party, because I don't think our democracy can go forward without a proper opposition. And
I think that's right.
Yeah. Well, Newt, thank you very, very much for taking the time.
It's always wonderful to be with you. You're a remarkable figure. Your personal courage has been amazing. And anytime I can be helpful, I'm a very big fan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this illuminating conversation. It's wonderful to talk to you always. And thank you for your service, years and years of service. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
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 Thank you for listening and for your continued support. This year, I'm looking forward to bringing on more guests that will challenge my thinking and yours, that will introduce new perspectives and counter old assumptions. You can let me know who you want me to bring on by commenting on my latest Instagram post. Until next time.